Hello all. So we are concluding lesson 38 now, discussing economy and society and something of culture in the late Roman Empire. And so how you should maybe think about those terms, it would be helpful to think about that the Roman Empire after Constantine is quite different, and society is different from the earlier empire. And this is a useful way to get a sense of how things were in the past, in contrast to how they were starting in the 4th century. So one of the important concepts, and the handout is really helpful here, is this transformation from principate to dominant. And you might recall that Augustus referenced himself as a princeps, a first among equals, which was of course a fantasy in many ways, but nevertheless that was a governmental attitude in which the idea was that the emperor was still first among equals. The concept of a dominus, after whom the dominate is named, is someone who is an absolute ruler, right? Whose power is so far above any kind of power that you might be able to think about. And that was part of a larger transformation in which society became much more hierarchical. And in a way, the best image to give here is this famous image of Constantine, which comes from a ginormous statue. And here is a guide to scale that should give you an idea of just how big this statue of Constantine must have been, and just how much above normal size society he sort of towered, also symbolically speaking, not just in the case of the statue. Here is another image in which we see a group of Roman soldiers. You can see their shield with the Christian symbol of the Chi Rho. And the emperor is now surrounded by different groups of people, including priests, as well as some senators. But very importantly, if you look at all these heads and faces, you see that it is the emperor who has the halo. And it gives us a real powerful sense of just how much above normal society and sort of whatever power you might have in normal society, how much the emperor was above that. Below the emperor, actually before we say that, so the absolute rule of the emperor entailed that he was the source of law. This is all listed on the handout. He was a supreme commander. And I think it was very important to think about him, that from the sacred position of just being an emperor, which was obviously as part of the imperial cult already a religious image, he now becomes sort of representative of God on earth, right? Which is a really much deeper and more powerful religious domination that we could imagine. And in addition to sort of looking like this, in fact, the administration is now that of a real monarchy. Everything is very hierarchical, and there is a lot of elaborate ritual. Everything is called sacred as part of the administration. This is something that started already in the 2nd century, but now it really kicks in. Incidentally, Constantine still has the title of Pontifex Maximus. It will only be later that emperors give that up. But I think it's just shows us that, in a sense, he's taking on the traditional roles, yet clearly this power has been transformed. Now, here's another important distinction of this hierarchical nature of society that is now not just the imperial court, but also below. And this is this distinction in late antique society between honestiores and humiliores. Now, if you look at these two Latin verbs, one of the things you can notice is that this one kind of seems to have the word honest in it, while this one, may be a little harder to see, but it's the humble, right? So in Roman society, increasingly we observe that people who have more money and power are classified into this group of honestiores, and those with less power and less money are identified as humiliores. And the point of this distinction is not simply sort of generalization or maybe just a way to say to someone that they are lower class, but in fact, it's a distinction in Roman law. So this distinction gets inscribed into Roman law. And the kind of thing we are talking about here is that, say you stole a chicken. I don't know why, if you're a member of the higher group, you would steal a chicken, but say you get accused of having stolen a chicken and you have to go to court and you're found guilty. In a case of if you come from among the honestiores, the punishment is probably, some kind of fine, versus if you come from the humiliores, they might cut off your head. Right, so these distinctions really inscribe society, and that society is in fact much more cruel for people who are of lower social rank. These lower classes also experience much less mobility. I think the Roman Empire to a significant extent was built on, even if you were a freedman, you could sort of rise up somewhat. There was still part of, at least for some social circles, an option. And increasingly now we see that if you are in any kind of lower level position in the economy, so for example, you're a tenant farmer, you might not be able to leave the land that you're working on. Or if your father is a soldier, you might have to become a soldier yourself. So what this suggests is that increasingly society becomes sort of rigid, right? You're either on the top or you're on the bottom. And mobility is essentially disappearing completely. Now, the way Constantine sort of contributes to this is in a number of important ways, and we are going to observe these in some more detail further on in this lecture. But I think that one part of this is the complete separation of the civil and military realms as administrative positions. You don't go back and forth between those two, which comes with also an army reorganization. More on this in a moment. But importantly now, senatorial rank will be tied to political position of leadership, but not to military ones, right? So we really see the separation very powerfully. And another way in which we will see also this, these further separations within society and administration is that there will be a new gold coin solidus that Constantine will introduce, which by the way will live on for about 1,000 years. As a successful gold coin. And the idea will be that this will be a coin that resists inflation, but this will not be a coin that your average person can afford. So we will see this sort of, everything is getting just a little bit more rigid, just a little bit more separated into categories. So a good way to start thinking about this is to think about city life. And one of the important observations that after Constantine, there is a slightly different history to city life, whether you're in the Western Empire or in the Eastern Empire. In the West, often cities decline. And in fact, the Christians will have to take over some civic functions. So for example, food will come through churches. In contrast, in the eastern part of the empire, which by the way will continue into the Byzantine Empire after the traditional name of Constantinople, in fact, the eastern cities will continue, they will be populated, and they still will have sort of semi-secular councils. Successful city life will still include some grain and oil distribution to citizens. However, increasingly, especially in the West, the elite will withdraw to their private luxurious villas in a countryside, for which they will provide their own fortification and strength. While in the cities, both in the East and the West, there will be quite a bit of poverty and suffering. And so in late antiquity, we hear a lot about riots, like famous riots like 387 in Antioch, which often lead to the massacre of citizens. So that kind of more organic relationship between the people and those ruling them, say in the city of Rome, that we might see in the late Republic, say in Rome, that is definitely disappearing. Increasingly, Rome will let in some barbarians who traditionally mingled more on the frontiers. But ever since Marcus Aurelius, we will actually see that Rome will actively recruit barbarians into the Roman army. And traditionally, there was very heavy Romanization for these soldiers. They had to learn Latin, they had to work with it. But we will see that in the 4th century, there's, for example, a certain point under Theodosius that 100,000 Visigoths will be recruited, and they will not be integrating anymore. So there will be that transformation. In terms of city life, and this is just the city of Rome, if we look at it in late antiquity and beyond. I just wanted to point out that most of the city that we have been dealing with was this bit, right? So on this side of the Tiber. And rather importantly, St. Peter's, which is of course a very important Christian center, and today it's the very center of Vatican City, which is a separate state within a separate state from Italy. That is on the other side of the river. And so although eventually churches will fill up sort of even this side of the Tiber, one of the early and important ways that these new Christian sites will develop is that they might be sort of further away from the traditional centers of the city. So the old St. Peter's, built probably for the first time around 330, which was a basilica. So you remember these long halls, right, with the little cross shape coming in this period, will be part of these new kind of buildings that we see in various churches around the empire. So as we look at the Roman Empire in late antiquity, we see these sort of divisions, and we see a lot of sort of separations into little units. And it's helpful to think a little bit about how the economy looks in this period. And so traditionally in the Roman Empire, in the first 2.5 centuries, we very much expect public benefactions to run quite a bit of the economy, and those decline. And the church will take on a new role in benefiting the people, and people in turn will benefit the church with inheritances. So the church will become sort of the hub of that kind of activity. As I mentioned earlier, under Constantine, there is this weird issue around that he develops this new stable gold coinage. At the same time, silver coinage, which will be hard to get even, and then the cheaper copper and bullion coins will become cheaper and cheaper. So there is a hyperinflation of all traditional forms of money over gold, right? So gold is solid, stable economy for members of the elite. But if you have any other kind of money, the value of that might disappear over time or be significantly reduced. And I think that one part of that will be sort of a parallel development, is that in addition to sort of the monetary economy, when you go to the store or wherever and you can buy something with money, we will see also sort of some economy that is in kind, meaning that you might barter for something. So the taxes follow some setup that was developed under Diocletian, with both based on land and based on individuals. And one of the main goals of this was to actually provide food for Rome and for the army. And part of the issue is that this is becoming increasingly a big deal, is that agricultural land is more and more in the hands of a few people rather than many small holders of farms. Total cultivated land shrinks. So we see that it will be actually harder to produce enough food. In addition, we will see a lot of state intervention into business. Ever since Diocletian, who had a failed attempt at limiting maximum prices of goods, we see the state intervention in both generally sort of not just on the level of issuing coins, but also on the level of industry and trade. And in particular, in late antiquity, we will see state-run workshops for arms, for uniforms, for various dyes. So that just shows us that the state now doesn't think that they can buy these things on the open market, which might have been a sort of business opportunity in the past. And also in trade, there's quite a bit of state intervention. I think maybe the most interesting thing about trade to me in late antiquity is that sort of maps change. So if traditionally one would say all roads lead to Rome, that Rome would be the center where you can buy everything and where they have everything. Now we see the development of new routes for trade. So Milan, Aquileia, Rhine-Danube, Rome is not central anymore. And part of the story, of course, has to do with a whole spatial transformation. And this is helpful for us to sort of summarize and end with, which is the development of pilgrimage, the idea that you should go and visit the sites where famous events took place in Christian history. And if we look at a map now of these travels, of course, Rome is still on this map. We know that Paul was in Rome, the Apostle Paul. But what we see here is that, of course, there is a new focus on the eastern part of the empire, right? So again, we see this sort of separation of East and West, and quite a bit of the pilgrimages are now taking people to the east, and especially, of course, to all these sites associated with the life of Jesus and his apostles. And so, in fact, we see sort of late antique world as being very different, very hierarchical, very not Rome-centered. And it is a little surprise that it starts to emerge as a completely almost different period that people often reference as late antiquity. Whether that was good or bad, or maybe there are some more elaborate ways of talking about that, is what we will conclude with in the final lesson.